Huge fan of our next guest. He's selling theaters out across the country. I shouldn't say stadiums. That's like Freddie Mercury. He's not quite there yet. Not enough billboards as Freddie Mercury, but big fan of him. I'd like to think we've helped with some of his success. We covered it early on with Canada and the bill going on there. So you can follow him, of course, if you don't know who he is yet, at Jordan B. Peterson. 12 Rules for Life is his book. Was number one. I think it's still up there. It could be number one on any given day on Amazon, any place you can get books. Dr. Jordan Peterson, thank you for being here, sir.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invitation. It's lovely to meet someone so sartorially splendid.
Yes. Well, listen, to appropriate is to appreciate. And the reason we did Honduras this week is because we've done it for 3 years now, and we're running out of ideas. So this is as good as we could come up with on short notice. Dr. Peterson, I know you're touring right now across the country to sold-out crowds. And, of course, you've gotten some protesters, some mobs. And we released a video this week to, a lot of views, a lot of interactions. Crowder confronts. And this has been confronting people who make online death threats or calls to action or plots of violence. And what was remarkable to me, I wanted to get your take on this as a clinical psychologist. No one with the mob when they're chanting. No one condemned actions of violence. You see this with Maxine Waters now. It is coming almost entirely from the left today, but it seems as though it's accelerated so rapidly in the last month. Have you seen this? And explain to people who don't know the actual phenomena of the mob mentality that occurs.
Well, in a mob, there's distribution of responsibility, right? Because everyone is faceless. And so, well, a lot of what keeps people sane is being held immediately responsible for their actions. And so That's why one-on-one interactions tend to remain peaceful. But of course, you can be anonymous in a mob. And then because you can be anonymous, if you're resentful or angry or anything like that, or vengeful, then you have the opportunity to let your worst, what would you say, the worst parts of you manifest themselves without fear of being called for your actions.
Before I interrupt you, was that a tugboat?
The anonymity. What's that?
I said, before I interrupt, I hate to interrupt, was that a tugboat? What was that sound that we just heard?
Oh, no, it's probably a water pump.
Okay, it comes through the speaker.
I'm in a motorhome, eh?
Okay, all right, so I continue. You were talking about the accountability, but through my headphones, it sounded like a tugboat. Continue, Doctor, I apologize.
Well, a mob allows people to hide, fundamentally.
Yeah.
This is also why you can't really apologize to a mob. If you're mobbed online, for example, and you apologize, there's not much point in it, because you can apologize to a person and you can offer to do better and you can say your mea culpas and all that. But the mob shifts and changes on you, and you can't hold a mob responsible as well, which is another reason why they're so dangerous.
That's a really interesting point. I never made the connection with President Donald Trump or conservative. I said, listen, they're gonna or like yourself, they're gonna label you a Nazi anyway, so you don't need to appeasing crocodiles is futile, is the old term. But sometimes you disconnect that really when you think of the media or you think of these people online, that it really is just a mob. It's a more diffuse mob. It's a mob across the country, but it's still a mob mentality no less. And that's why I've always said apologizing for the sake of appeasement is really stupid. If you think you've done something wrong, apologize. But these apology tours right now, they never work. Is Roseanne any less fired today? I don't think so.
Well, the other thing too is that the part of the mob that you apologize to isn't necessarily the same mob that goes after you apologize.
Right.
You have some sense on social media that when people come after you, it's a group and it's got defined borders. And so maybe you're interacting with that and trying to appease it or to apologize for it. But it isn't something with defined borders, and the apology will just inflame another mob. You can't distinguish it from the original mob. It's the same subjectively, but it's not helpful. It's not helpful.
Well, let me ask you this then. Separating from what we've been doing with the Crowder Confront series, let's say someone online finds themselves being mobbed because of a tweet or something that they posted at some point, and they think they're actually wrong, but they know that people are going after them because they want to see them destroyed regardless. Should they apologize because they feel they were wrong, or should they just move on down the trail? What's the best way for them to handle that?
Well, I don't know if they should apologize on Twitter, that's for sure, because Twitter doesn't look like it's a good place for reasoned conversations. True. I mean, that might be something. One of the things I've started to do with Twitter, because it's it's an impulsive medium, is that if I have something to say that needs to be said in detail, then maybe I'll write a blog about it. And then it can be reasoned and longer form. And I think that's really important. The short form of Twitter seems to make people stupid and impulsive. I mean, Twitter has its utility, but it's a dangerous medium.
Yeah.
And then, well, and if you're going to apologize, you need to do that very carefully. And I wouldn't do it, as you pointed out, I wouldn't do it for appeasement. The purpose of an apology is to set the situation right usually between two individuals. And to apologize properly, you have to figure out what you did wrong. You have to figure out why you did it. Then you have to set those things right so that you won't repeat the error in the future. I mean, if you want an apology from someone, say, if you've had an argument with them or if they've slighted you, if you want to maintain the relationship, you want to find out that they figured out why they did what they did.
Right.
They're doing what they can to set it right, but that they also won't repeat it in the future. And that constitutes an apology. But, you know, people get afraid when they get mobbed and then they backpedal because, well, sometimes they also think if all those people objected, maybe they were wrong, you know, but it doesn't seem to be a very effective strategy. In fact, it looks counterproductive most of the time to me.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think that ties right back to when you were saying what's required for an apology. That's why you can't ask a mob to apologize because they're not capable of
Well, that's also why groups. It's also why groups don't have rights.
Right.
You know, you can hold an individual responsible. Nothing that can't be held responsible has rights. This is why animals don't have rights, even though you should treat them properly. That's not the same thing. You have a responsibility to care for animals properly as much as you can and not to produce undue suffering. But that doesn't mean that animals have rights.
Right.
And animals don't have rights and groups don't have rights because you can't hold them responsible. Jesus, it's such an elementary truth. You'd think that we would have figured that out after a couple of 100 years of discussions about rights. But it's a crucial issue because responsibility is, well, and it's also the case that it's responsibility, not rights, that are the bedrock of our society,
right.
Which is something I've been talking to these crowds about constantly. And everybody's very, well, I don't know if they're crowds. I've been talking to the individuals that make up the crowds that are coming to see me about responsibility. And that seems to be going extremely well. And this violence thing you've been talking about, like I would really, really caution everyone in a situation like this to do everything they can to turn the other cheek, because we're in a situation, a polarized situation is very dangerous because one person slaps the other and then this person punches this person and then this person hits this person with a stick, and like it starts to escalate.
Yeah.
And that escalation is really, really dangerous. And you want to do everything you can to forestall that because it can get out of hand. It's a positive feedback loop and it can get out of hand very, very rapidly.
Yeah, it is a positive feedback loop. Here's my question. I see a lot of people out there saying, "Oh, we're polarized," as though polarization in and of itself is immoral. Well, it's not. If let's say people are polarized from the Nazis, to use a leftist example, not saying anyone here is a Nazi. If you find there's a giant chasm between you and communists, I don't think that being divided on an issue is inherently immoral. But the proactive polarization through lies and through calls to violence, so in other words, calling your opposition Nazis, trying to paint them as subhuman sort of caricatures. Some people out there saying, "Oh, the left and the right are responsible." I know I don't consider you right or left. I consider you just a thinker and some more of a philosopher in a lot of ways. I know I'm more conservative. It's no secret with my audience. I contend that it's coming exclusively from the left on a large scale today.
Yeah. Well, be that as it may, it's still going to be incumbent on everyone who wants to maintain peace to keep a level head. You know, and that's the crucial issue. I mean, because, well, what's the alternative? And I would also say we should look at some situational variables that are at play here too. I've been thinking about this a lot, talking about it with Ruben and some of the other people in this so-called intellectual dark web. I mean, I think part of what's happening, Stephen, is that as the classic media dies, it gets more and more desperate to attract the remaining attention that it can attract. And so it's highlighting extreme opinions. And it's doing that in an attempt, it's really clickbait. And so that's driving this apparent polarization far faster than I think it actually exists, because my sense is that the vast majority of people out there are pretty much the same as they were 5 years ago and are vastly reasonable. But there's an exaggeration of the ideological idiocy. Now, I share your proclivity to think that a substantial amount of this is coming from the radical left. You know, and I think that's partly because that's being subsidized in the universities.
Yeah.
That's a huge source of it. But I think it's being exaggerated by the death throes of the classic media as these new technologies come up to supplant them. they're getting increasingly desperate and telling more and more desperate stories in an attempt to hold on to the fragments of their audience. And so it might be a mirage in some sense. This increased polarization might be a mirage that's a consequence of the death spiral of the classic media.
Yeah, I hate to disagree with Dr. Jordan Peterson, but I would slightly, because I know I agree with you with the radical left. But here's something that I ask a lot of people, and I want you, and I know you choose your words very carefully, so I want you to think about it for a second. This is a genuine question. Can you name me anyone today in 2018, anyone on the national DNC platform bench who we wouldn't consider radical left? Bernie Sanders, Hillary Clinton, Nancy Pelosi, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, Elizabeth Graham, Maxine Waters, Eric Schneiderman. Can you name any one of them who would be as reasonable as people like even a Rubio on the right? I can't find any. I don't think it's the radical left when it's the whole platform.
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I think that the question is to what degree the moderate left has been willing or able to separate themselves from the radical left. And this is a big problem. I mean, one of the things I've been trying to puzzle out intellectually is, and I've been challenging the people that I'm speaking with, and including the journalists, is like, we know the left can go too far, right? That's a historical fact. No one disputes that if they have any sense. The question is, when exactly does the left go too far? What combination of policies do they put forth that produces the proclivity towards tyranny and catastrophe that characterized the radical left movements in the 20th century? And the answer is, nobody's been able to specify it. Like, I think it's the triad in what we're seeing right now, the triad of diversity, inclusivity, and equity is a deadly triad, especially equity, because that's a cover for equality of outcome. And I think equality of outcome doctrines are absolutely catastrophic. I think identity politics itself, the idea that we're fundamentally defined by our group identity, I think that's an absolutely abhorrent policy. And I think that the left has an absolute moral obligation to sort that out. But I would also say that it's a technical problem for the rest of us, centrists and conservatives, as well as left-wingers, is like, what exactly is it in the leftist policies that produce the catastrophic outcome? Because one thing you can say about the left, I think about the necessity for the existence of the left, is that hierarchies tend to dispossess people. And that's a standard postmodernist claim, but it's also true. And the dispossessed, the working class, let's say, need a voice. But the problem is that too much concern in that direction starts to tilt and produce very pathological outcomes. And we're certainly seeing that right now. And we need to be able to sort it out intellectually. When do they go too far? What do you like? The right goes too far when it makes claims of racial or ethnic superiority. That's kind of the consensus, right? But it's not so easy to put your finger on exactly when the left makes its fatal error. Maybe it's a combination of policies that does it.
I don't even know that I would consider that necessarily right-wing, because the last people to do it were just racist socialists. I mean, even if you look at the Tiki Torches guys today, if you look at their speeches, when they try to associate this with the right, I go, hold on, listen to their speeches. They're talking about an expanded government welfare state, if only if we got rid of the blacks, browns, and Jews. It's very, very left, and they have to be racist. But let me ask you this.
I know, well,
let me posit this, because you said, what is it, as far as the left, and you talked about the hierarchy, and we've talked about the mob mentality. Could the through line be weakness, equality of outcomes? That's a way for compensating for weakness. The mob mentality, it's to compensate for fear of your own weakness. When you look at this demanded hierarchy, demanded power of the state, that's one thing that we've come in consistently, these people who make the threats, who call actions of violence, who paint their opposition as Nazis. It seems to be very weak-minded people.
Well, it seems to me that it might be more associated with resentment. Because it's resentment masquerading as compassion. But the problem is, it's still hard to delimit as a policy.
Right.
Now, you said something that I thought was interesting about the right and the left. The way that I've been conceptualizing the political landscape at the moment, generally we think of right and left and the distribution between them. But I think really the right way of thinking about what's happening right now is it's collectivist versus individualist. And then on the collectivist end, you have the left-wing collectivists and the right-wing collectivists.
Right.
And the left-wing collectivists are playing the victim narrative, and the right-wing collectivists are playing the ethnic identity card. And so the real dispute is between the collectivists and the individualists. And in my writings and in my tours and lectures and so forth, I've been making a very strong individualist case, because I think the idea that our societies, our functional societies, and let's say our functional Western societies, one of the ideas that we really got right was the sovereignty of the individual, and the idea that when you look at the world, you should look at a world of individuals, whether that's historical or present or future. That should be your conceptual framework, primarily focused on the individual.
Yeah.
And the collectivists, and I think the leftists have the loudest collectivist voice at the moment. The collectivists insist that no, there isn't any individual, there's just a collective. And it's interesting too, because of the left-wing assaults on free speech. I've been thinking of them through. It isn't free speech that the radical leftists are mounting an assault on. It's the idea that there is such a thing as free speech, because the radical leftist collectivist claim is that you can't speak as an individual because there is no individuals. You can only serve as a mouthpiece for the power claims of your group.
Yeah.
And that's an unbelievably pernicious ideology. So I think it's the fundamental proclivity of the collectivists to view the world through a lens that focuses everything on group identity. I think that's the real killer.
Well, you're a buzzkill today, because you're not talking about policy. You're talking about deeply rooted, infectious ideology, and you're right. Damn it, Jordan, you're right. And so when I show up in Ranger panties and an Uncle Sam costume and get my head almost knocked off, I feel like I have to do this because they need to be afraid of somebody.
Well, I've got a question about that too. Like, so you've been confronting people who are making claims of violence, and so let me ask you this. Like, first of all,
more actual plots.
Okay,
yeah.
So what's that been like for you? And do you feel that you're like, are you inflaming things? Are you satirizing them? Like, what role do you think you're playing in this?
So a couple of things, I think, and that's a good question. You know, as we say in the video, sorry, every time I move, I'm trying not to move with this ruffling here. We have hours and hours and many dozens of millions of plays on Change My Mind videos, right? Where we sit down and we say anyone can sit down and have a conversation and it's unedited. So
what the left wants,
yes, this is what they say, discussions. And this happened in Austin, where actually there were a few. So you know, we've taped a handful of these, by the way. We just sit on the footage and let them lie about it, and then release the video because it's more fun that way. So we sat down and we actually had a transgender city council candidate sit down for 40 minutes. It was very civil. She came back at another Change My Mind and said, "Hey, thank you so much for being so polite."
Very nice.
So we had these. That's our goal. But when you post our location and you actively plot to harm me or my crew, that changes things. And the point here is no longer to convince these people who want acts of violence to stifle the conversation, but for people who may not be aware. We have to understand this. This is one thing that a lot of people don't understand. Probably about 85%, maybe 90% of Americans, even those who are registered Republican or Democrats, they don't necessarily know what we know. They don't live in this world. They don't live in the YouTube and the blogosphere world. They're not aware of how bad it is out there. And so this kind of content, I can tell you, you can read the comment section, thousands of people going, "I was just vaccinated against ever becoming a Democrat," or "I cannot believe it has gotten this bad. I really need to take an active role and join a local chapter." So
you think these people only exist on Twitter?
Yeah.
You think they're just Twitter trolls? You don't think these are real life people?
And the truth is, we have eyes and ears everywhere, and it's very deeply rooted. And I mean, you know, we've had several people arrested, reported to police for other acts of violence, not including myself. So that's the purpose for it. Have a conversation. When they try to stop it through violence, expose them to the rest of the world.
Yeah, okay. And do you think that seems on the face of it very reasonable? Do you think, what's your sense? Do you think that the fact that you're bringing this to light is doing more good than the fact that you're engaged in this is doing harm?
I do. Yeah, I do. And again, the reason why is because so many people are not aware. You get outside of you, myself, Rubin, Shapiro, Rogans of the world, and a lot of people are not aware how bad the left has become. And when they see 20, 30 people, and none of them will say, "Hold on a second," posting an address and saying, "Blow up this guy's van with people in it," when no one will say that's bad, the millions of people watching go, "Oh, wow. Oh, wow. This is something I need to be aware of. I need to be careful here and know what the left is up to." So that's the...
Well, it does seem to fall under the auspices of self-defense in that situation. I mean, I'm just curious about it because, and it's not a criticism. It's genuine curiosity. You have a large platform, and I'm trying to figure out ways that this can be discussed and brought to light, say, that don't simultaneously produce the probability that the violence is going to increase. It's not an easy thing to do. I mean, and your point is, well, it makes more sense to show what's going on
Yeah.
and that's the better strategy. And I guess that's a free speech strategy in some sense. And it's one
well,
of the
our first
one of the-
strategy is change my mind. Our first strategy is open discussion, and
Yeah.
it's like in combat sports. We match intensity. At a certain point, you've got to get your dukes up. And there are a lot of other people out there who've been sucker punched. A lot of other people who've had tires slashed or have been actively. I mean, they handed you a knife for the Ben Shapiro event.
Ice pick.
At a certain point, it doesn't. I don't believe it does anyone any favors to sweep it under the rug in the hopes that these people will be peaceful. Especially when you have Maxine Waters out there encouraging it. They're getting more violent, and it really worries me. And I do think sunlight for that is the best disinfectant, provided you are also having discussions and rational debates, which we do. And number one, of course, it's wildly entertaining because this is a comedy.
And what do you think? What do you think the consequences of these change my mind events that you've been having?
Yeah, those have been. I mean, we've. I mean, how many millions of comments and people who've actively changed their minds? I mean, I can tell you 6 figures of people who've become pro-life from watching that.
Okay.
Which for us.
Okay, so
great.
you think you have some credible evidence that the rational discussion end of it is actually producing some real exchange of views and some transformation of outcome.
Yeah.
So that would be a good thing.
Yeah. I think it's a good thing. I think the number one thing is, the show has to be obviously entertaining. It's a late night show, but the point is we have eyes and ears and our roots really deeply rooted in the leftist activism. I mean, the FBI has been calling our guys for information on Antifa since Utah because of how far we've gotten into their cryptic messaging. And I can tell people this, it's gotten a lot worse. The rumblings are a lot worse, including for yourself.
I've been fortunate. Well, none of my shows have been protested except one in Portland, and there was about 50 people. Surprise, surprise. And there was about 50 people there, and there was a couple of Antifa types, and they were dressed in black with masks, and that anonymization of protesters, that's a very dangerous thing. When someone shows up and they're dressed in black and they have a mask and you can't tell who they are, absolutely they're up to no good.
It's like the real life YouTube comment section where people live anonymously, so they say whatever they want. It's the same thing. Put it in real life where they just
Now take
that anonymity. I would say anonymity in those situations is the hallmark of a dangerous coward. And so for those of you who are out there hiding behind anonymity, that's how you're manifesting yourself in reality.
Yeah.
Dangerous coward.
And that's a big part of this too, is unmasking the anonymity, if only for the most violent and the most egregious offenders. All right, the book, of course, is 12 Rules for Life. Highly recommended if you want to be productive. Also, if you want to learn about lobsters. Always love that tidbit when I read this book. At Jordan B. Peterson. And hey, where's the best place for people to follow your tour if they're not aware yet that you might be in their city?
Oh, they can go to my website, jordanbpeterson.com, and look up events. Yep, and I think that discount voucher I made for your people for self-authoring is still available too. So
okay, for self-authoring.com, I think it's Crowder, right?
Yep, that's right. That's right.
And I highly recommend it, self-authoring.com, 12 Rules for Life. Get the book. Dr. Peterson, thank you so much. We have Nick DiPaolo coming up. Please stay safe and enjoy your shows.
Yep.